Hi, everybody. I'm Scott, and thanks for joining me again today for another edition of the podcast in support of the film Skin on Skin, The Rise and Fall of the World's Largest Furrier. We have another fun one lined up for you today. I had so many calls and texts and emails telling me how much people enjoyed our last episode where we dug into the origin stories of people and how they came to Evans. So we're going to do part 2 of that today, but turn the dial inward a little bit and show you a look at myself and my family members in the Meltzer family, my cousins, and how we all ended up at Evans. And there's some interesting tales there. Some of it weaves into some of the stories of the Meltzer family as a whole. And I think combined with what we showed you last week, it's another interesting set piece to put on top of the whole layers of a building brick that we're putting together here to explain the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier and the family behind it. So, as always, why don't we begin by, you know what? No, forget that. We're going to launch right into it today. I'm going to start with probably the most important origin story of all. This one's from the film, actually, and it's that of the man who made it all possible for us, A.L. Meltzer, the oldest son of Rose and Julius Meltzer, who came over to the United States from Belarus in 1912. And shortly after being here, the parents were unable to support the family. So A.L. and Herman Meltzer left school and went to work. And the result was Evans Furs.
My mother was a model at a store downtown Philadelphia, and my father went to work at that store. Somehow, I don't know how, ended up in the fur department. With his knowledge of furs, he became well known in the business. And somebody from Chicago offered him a better job, more money, and a managerial job. My father and mother picked up and moved to Chicago, not knowing a soul. And my father went to work for this man for several months and found out he was a goner and couldn't work for him anymore. So he quit, and he said to my mother, I'm going to open up my own store. They put an ad in the Tribune, in the Sunday Tribune, for squirrel scarves, which were very popular in the early 30s. And somehow he came up with the name Evans, and he rented a storefront in the State and Lake building. And Monday morning, my mother and father walked up the how many flights it was, and women were lined up 4 flights down by the squirrel scarves. This is in the midst of the Depression, and that's how the business got started. They sold out in an hour.
My cousin Robert Meltzer, who was the son of David Meltzer and the grandson of A.L. Meltzer, would become CEO of the company in its later years. And here, Robert explains his coming into the company, the situation with the company and the business at the time, and why he just kind of knew that it wasn't going to work out.
I really knew from the time I started in the business that there was no way that business was going to be around for me to retire, because I knew the industry wasn't going to survive. I knew it. I didn't really want to take over as CEO. I was perfectly comfortable as GMM, which was where my strength was. And I think the only thing that motivated me to want to become CEO is that we had Pat Reagan was the CEO, and the only participation that he had in the business was financial. But obviously, in hindsight, I would have preferred never to have taken over that job, because it was a thankless job. And regardless of who was going to be CEO, the company was not going to survive. It may have survived a little longer with Pat because he had the relationship with lenders. You also had a situation where he had a board member who was very influential with David, who really wanted to see the company go out of business. And it's hard for me to figure out why he wanted that, but he had malintent from the beginning. Because my ego wasn't really invested in that business, it didn't bother me much. I don't think I was prepared to be CEO of a company that was struggling when I was in my early 30s. And I don't think there was anything anybody could have done differently than what I did 10 years later that would have been any more successful. The guys who were running the business really didn't give thought to trying to look into the future. They were really just building on what my grandfather had set up in 1948.
Before they were married even, Robert Meltzer's future wife, Jennifer Pogatz Meltzer, would come into the company. She was a fashion model. You've seen her interviewed on the podcast, and if you've seen the film, you see her in the film. And she has a different avenue from which she came into Evans first, literally through the fashion and modeling avenue. And here's her story about how she made her way into the family and into Evans first.
My father, I don't think my dad even graduated high school. Okay. And he clearly worked his way up from sweeping the vault to where he eventually got. But there was an incident with AL. He was still working on the floor, I guess my mom just told me, and they were in some kind of a meeting, and AL said something my dad didn't like. Now, my dad had a temper. It took a lot to get him to show his temper, but when he did, it was blackout angry temper. And AL said something, and my dad leapt across the table and started choking him at a meeting. Security had to be called. He had to be pulled off of him. Security drove him home. And I don't know why, but he didn't get fired. So my understanding was that he made some critical comment of an idea of my dad's, and there was some kind of, AL admired him for standing up for himself, I guess, for lack of a better reason for him not getting canned.
Before they were married even, Robert Meltzer's future wife, Jennifer Pogatz Meltzer, would come into the company. She was a fashion model. You've seen her interviewed on the podcast, and if you've seen the film, you see her in the film. And she has a different avenue from which she came into Evans first, literally through the fashion and modeling avenue. And here's her story about how she made her way into the family and into Evans first.
I started working for the company in the 70s, in like the mid 70s, and it was huge. I didn't know who I was working for because I was working as a model doing print. And then my first interaction with David Meltzer was doing a small commercial that Sharon had just left. And it was really kind of funny, but it was a really cool commercial. Then the opening of Drury Lane East in Water Tower Place, which was a major, major event, was a 2-day rehearsal choreographed show for all the Evans, let's say, clientele, people around town, press, TV. It was outrageous. I mean, everything was televised. What Evans did for their customers was amazing. I mean, it was one of those, come, have hors d'oeuvres, watch the show. And it was amazing. It was beautiful. I mean, this was incredible. The choreographer came in from New York. The music, I mean, it was stunning. And yeah, Evans had a great reputation. There wasn't a day that we could look at the Sun-Times or the Chicago Tribune and that's Evans' presence. And it just kept getting better. I mean, it just kept getting better from the 70s to the 80s. And then it started about 1986. There was some things going on.
I'm Michael Idless, and this is Skin on Skin, the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier, Part 2. So let's review. We have Rose Walcove being sold to Julius Meltzer when still a spinster at age 29. They're coming to America first class, on the backs of her wealthy Trans-Siberian Railroad engineer brothers. Rose's depression, sending her reeling and eventually to bed, to stay. Julius can't support the family, so oldest sons A.L. and Herman leave school to go to work. Oldest daughter Thelma is sent to finishing school to learn to care for them all. Brother Herman assists Brother A.L. and his wife Minerva in the startup of Evans Furs, only for Herman to go into a slow, lifelong depression, clearly a result of the lack of parenting from Rose and Julius. Brother-in-law Harold Sussman and his wife, oldest daughter Thelma, are sent to Boston to expand the company east. Thelma never forgives her brothers for the move away from the family. And let's not forget A.L.'s son David. Oh, David, the crown prince who would wear the crown alone in his own personal cocoon that he himself created. Loved by those who worked for him, admonished by family for his selfish and narcissistic ways. Along the way, a fur company empire is built, and the Meltzers thrive while at the same time suffering the consequences of their parents' abandonment as tragedy checks in for an extended stay. As we recounted, from the moment they began selling squirrel scarves in 1929, Evans Furs seldom knew from tough times. What A.L. Meltzer had hit upon was growing and growing, and the business kept moving forward. Which leads us to part 2, and the term, when you get to the top of the highest peak, there's only one direction you can go.
My cousin, Marnie Miller, in this next clip, discusses Evans Furs, how she might have gone into the business had it not been for her raising her family, and some of her feelings on her brother David.
My brother never should have had the business. My father should have closed it. And as an aside, if I was not raising a family, which was my main portion, that was my part of my life, I did not want anything to do with the business. I should have gone in the business. I had more head for the business than my brother. My brother ran the business into the ground for his own self-worth. I have friends who were on the board of directors of the business. They all left him. My brother was greedy, extremely greedy. He had his own private plane. He had his place in Aspen. He had his place in outside of Rainier. He paid a lot of his bills through the business. He ran the business into the ground. My biggest mistake, because I couldn't do it, I should have taken him to court. I should have sued him. He lost money. Not only he he drained the business. He drained the business for Bob and Jeff. He drained the business for me. He drained the business for my kids. They all should have had a part of it.
A.L. Meltzer's grandson, Jeffrey Meltzer, the younger son of David Meltzer, would also find his way to Evans Furs. At one point, Jeffrey even ran the Far East operations in Hong Kong and Korea and China for Evans. Here, he describes how he made his way into the company and how things might played out differently.
He had wanted me to come into the business. He was upset with me that I didn't come into the business and pressured me to. Then I did. But it was a really, really rocky thing because on the one hand, my grandfather had wanted me to take over the business, but my father had always preferred, and my brother showed zero interest in the business. And my father pressured him to come in because Bob was either like him or the embodiment of what he wanted to be, was an athlete and God knows.
She had a lot of regret that she and I think it was anger, even though it wasn't rage, but that she resented what was withheld from her and that her brothers were allowed to thrive and frankly to soar, and that she wasn't. And it had to do with the fact that she was a woman.
With her Boston accent, and she would talk a mile a minute, and she'd ask me questions, and I'd start to answer, and she'd already be on to another question or talking about something else. She wanted to hear what I had to say, but she didn't really want to hear what I had to say, but it didn't matter. I knew she was there was a pride.
Helene Walsh was the older daughter of Marnie Miller and Jerry Miller, Marnie Miller being A.L. Meltzer's daughter. She also made her way to Evans Furs, my cousin Helene. And here in this next clip, she talks about coming into Evans Furs, the fun she had working in various aspects of the business, and I guess you could say her trials and tribulations at modeling fur coats.
They must have treated the staff well. Family was a different story, but and family was expected to go 1,000% above and beyond. And I understand that. That's the way they were raised. That's how they started. And we were just an extension of them. And I get that. But I'm really amazed by how many people, and I will say though, where else were you going to go? The other businesses were really small by comparison. The other fur businesses, A and B, I did ultimately go, once I got remarried, I got divorced, and years later, I went and worked for another small-time Furrier. And this guy was a real piece of garbage, real garbage, disgusting. I hate it. I wound up hating it. I'd never worked for someone whom I hated before. It was just awful. And that was a small operation up in Glencoe of all places. So there weren't many other places to go. But I loved being on the floor, and the hours were long. It was boring, and I loved learning about taking care of the furs. But my favorite part, I loved working in New York. Oh my God, I loved working in New York. I loved working in the design. I liked working with the other manufacturers. I loved in New York. Although I have a very funny story. I was being used at one point but I don't know, couple racks of furs had come in from one of the other, manufacturers in the building. And they were like, Helene, we need you, try on these coats. And I'm like, everyone was too long. And they're like, what the? They were like, so they measured my arms. My arms were short.
My cousin Michael Miller, who you hear from in the film quite a bit, also made his way to Evans into the training program one summer, and he was able to go unnoticed, as he describes in this clip, talking about the time when he took a stab at the fur business and how it all ended up for him afterwards, and how life came full cycle for Michael Miller.
I enjoyed the company. I enjoyed going to visit. Always had a great time whenever I was there and getting to know the people within the organization. And I actually did do a summer training program there. So I was there for 100 days or so, 3.5 months or so. And two things were rewarding. One, I really enjoyed learning more about the fur business and about furs, about the organization and the people that were there. And I was also appreciative that nobody realized my relationship to David Meltzer until the last day, with one exception. Norm Geller and Mark Pospernak knew who I was in my relationship, but nobody else with on the floor of the fur salon knew who I was. So that was rewarding and fun, and I liked the business. I realized that I didn't want to be in a business that was primarily commission-based, which is funny because now I'm a commission-based real estate broker. So it all comes full circle at some point.
Who doesn't love a rags to riches story? But a rags to riches to collapse story? Well, let's see what you think after hearing this tale.
There were two Evans furs. The one that climbed to the top of the highest peak, amazing story, especially after the situation these siblings were put in by their parents, and the one that tumbled from that peak decades later because of its own mismanagement and hubris. But that's not the tragedy. The tragedy is what happened in between.
What these brothers achieved was pretty remarkable. You know, they lived the American dream, and they let a lot of people come in and live it with them. And it was a wonderful story until it wasn't.
Coming from a generation that was so driven and willing to work 18 hours a day to be successful, there aren't that many people like that anymore.
He built a little, one little office into a world-famous fur company.
They created something out of nothing. They created something out of whole cloth, and it went a public company. And he helped kings and queens around the world with their fur coats.
To me, it was majestic. It was just very, it was very cool. All these people running around. I just liked the whole ambience of it all.
That was the era, I would say, the golden era of department stores and specialty stores.
A tale about life under different times, a tale about how circumstances forced siblings to band together, save a family, and enrich the world when they had no other choice. No, not exactly. Not this time.
Question about genetics. Is there some genetic loading that predisposes family members to depression and maybe some other mental disorders. And what you'll hear in medicine pretty uniformly is that genetics loads the gun, but it's the environment that pulls the trigger.
Non-existent parenting, and so they didn't learn how to cope with stresses.
Always like each other, but they relied upon one another. They were there for each other.
There were these powerful, high-achieving people, and the perception is that you either were at the top and you stayed there, and otherwise it was hard to find your place.
When you're the last manufacturer of bunny whips and no one's driving a bunny anymore, what are you going to do to be successful?
I said, David, I've been telling you for months that you needed to do something because this company is going down the toilet. I mean, going down the toilet. You need to do something here, and you haven't.
Andrea Meltzer, who is the spouse of Jeffrey Meltzer, in this next clip discusses her coming to Evans Furs, her initial job working at North Riverside in the dress department, barely even knowing that the fur department existed, and her getting in a little bit of trouble early on by committing a major sin that none of us should do in retail so as to put ourselves in harm's way.
1980, I wasn't ready to wear. So it was a different experience than being in the fur business. And I didn't even come close to the fur business until later on when I became a coat buyer, because I came in as I started at the ground level. I was a manager of the dress department in North Riverside. And in fact, I got in terrible trouble because North Riverside was not the nicest of malls. And there was a group of people who came in, and I saw them stealing something and they left, and I chased them into the parking lot. And I got called into David's office the next day and got my hand slapped for doing that. But what I found was so I was not at Central. I wasn't. It's on State Street for a while. I was out at North Riverside, and my impression, it was people were really, really happy to work there. It was a nice environment. It was just it felt like a family. I was really, there were people, there was a lot of opportunity to learn from people. And it was, people just, look, there was certainly a curiosity about me, and I knew that because I was marrying Jeff. But I always knew which people were sincere and which ones weren't. But there was very, very much a curiosity. People asked me questions all the time about the family. And those who didn't became my friends.
Melissa Miller, another one of the children of Marnie and Jerry Miller, talks about in this next clip modeling fur coats and fur boots as a little child on the runway. And then she talks about trying to come back to work at Evans Furs, only to be thwarted by her Uncle David after going on a trip to Europe.
I do remember being in a fashion show and wearing go-go boots and a fur coat. So this is it. I came back from Europe. I worked at Evans beforehand, and I came back from Europe, and in essence, he made me re-interview for my job. And that was gone 9 months. And my father was ballistic. and started to look closer at everything. And did not like what he saw. And he wiped his hands. He said, "We're done. You treated family like shit. You treat shit like family, and you are rotting the family." And we put an end to it. Oh, he put an end to it. I wasn't I mean, I was very aware of it, but my life didn't alter at that point dramatically. I pay attention, and I was, yeah, it altered. I think David ended up being a major disappointment to my mother, especially at the end where he said one thing and did another. And again, treated shit like family and family like shit.
A lot of it has to do with the direction that you see the company going in and the direction that you see yourself going in.
In hindsight, I would have preferred never to have taken over that job because it was a thankless job. And regardless of who was going to be CEO, the company was not going to survive.
The 6 months that shook the Evans Fur Company.
So it was all about building trust and relationship. It was the manufacturers, I'm sure, that, I don't want to say pushed.
But start and tell us with where we are in time and what you're doing at about the time that... Do you mind if we walk around your place a little bit and show people how that looks?
No, absolutely. So... Okay.
Hi, everybody. I'm Scott. Thanks for joining me again today for another episode of the podcast in support of the film Skin on Skin, the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier.
And I looked at him and I said, "Where are you putting the fur?"
What made him think that he could come in and turn this place around? It was so much more than what he was trying to do.
All I know is that, Larry wanted my job and had been sniping at me.
Absolutely not. I mean, okay, so I was the merchandise manager. I had been I was in 5 different positions.
And, it was real clear to me that blood was thicker than water and that wasn't going to be a possibility.
Everybody was just such milquetoast.
It was when Evans was starting to run low on cash, so there wasn't any money to do any remodeling.
He really just was opposed to the whole notion of family being involved in the business.
And I go, that man's going to ruin this company. With that attitude, you just don't go in and say, I know better, because you don't know shit.
So friends, that's a recap of what brings us to where we are here. The start of season 2 of the podcast in support of the film Skin on Skin, the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier, part 2. Susan Yost is one of the daughters of Gene and Bernie Meltzer, and she never worked at Evans, but she found a way to enjoy it nonetheless, as she explains here in this clip.
Uncle Mel, we saw him for dinner sometimes. He was, I guess, interested in us, but he died when I was 16, so I don't have a whole lot of memories of conversations with him. We were lucky that he was very generous with discounts at Evans, and so
I got most of my coats there, including a sheepskin coat, and Joan got a rabbit fur when she was 21, and then got something else when she was going off to Russia for a year, a very warm fur coat for her year in Russia. Mom always had fur coats, and Dad actually had fur hats. And then I had various clothes, dresses from Evans.
Now, let's remember that almost all of the Meltzers worked at one time or another at Evans. So going back to the initial group of Meltzers, A.L. and Herman founded the company. Bernie and Jack worked there various summers, and Bernie helped the company with legal issues throughout much of his career. My grandmother Thelma was one of the company's biggest supporters, as was my great aunt Edith. But the boys were all involved in the company.
Evans was like the schlock. In the world, we were like big guys. You traveled the world. We had respect all over. In Chicago, we were like the scum. In the, sold basically the black trade. We're always promoting the good furriers were Bonwiteller, Irwin Ware, Rosenthal, Buddy Alper. They sold all the Jews. McElroy sold all the Gentiles. I still sell McElroy in Lake Forest, actually. But in Evans, it was like I was embarrassed to say, that I was with Evans to any of the, like fancy white people. Like our friends, people didn't come to me for a coat or something. They went to those guys. But in the world, we were the big machers. We bought a lot and we paid. What more do you want?
And the last, friends, I'll give you a little bit of insight into my complicated psyche, because I too ended up at Evans for 21 years. Even though when I was young, I knew I wanted to do something else, but this family business was in my family. It was in my blood. It was in my bones. And it's pretty much where I was going to end up, at least at the beginning. How did I get to Evans Furs? Well, I was born into it. My great uncles started this company in 1929. They brought my grandfather in shortly after he married their sister, my grandmother. He brought my father in when my parents got married. That ended when they got divorced. And by the time I was born, it was a foregone conclusion. I really didn't have much say in the matter. I loved music and I loved film and wanted to do something with one of either or both, just something creative. But I was always told, why would you do that when we have this family business that you can go into and work hard and be successful? When I was 14 going on 15, I began working downtown in Boston at Kennedy's, which was where our lease department was at the time. And Frank Riccio was the person I reported to. He was my grandfather's assistant. And then a few years later, when we moved into Jordan Marsh, he took over. And he beat me into shape pretty good. And after college in 1982, I went back to Chicago and joined the executive training program. And from there, I was put into various departments and worked in the lease departments and eventually made my way to California, where at least I wasn't doing music and movies, but I was home. I was near Hollywood. And that's how I got into Evans. While we await the release of the first film, Skin on Skin, The Rise and Fall of the World's Largest Furrier, Parts 2 and Parts 3 are in production, with completion dates for 2025 and 2026. So hopefully beginning sometime in 2025 or 2026, these 3 films will become available to you. In the meantime, enjoy what we're showing you here, digging down deep, tearing things apart, pulling back the layers of the onion on these podcasts in support of the film. In fact, here's for part 2 of Skin on Skin, The Rise and Fall of the World's Largest Furrier. Those Meltzer kids obviously weren't taught how to cope or how to parent or relationship skills were really lacking, and that got passed down.
DNA really plays a role in any, in anyone's well-being, physical and or mental health.
All I know is that he had a photographic memory. He was brilliant, and the family loved him. Everybody in the family loved him, and it was an absolute shock.
Yeah, I think she loved the way I looked, so she was always, like I was her little doll. She loved, but she was very interesting and fun and vivacious.
All of his grandchildren wrote reports on Nuremberg at some point in school. Someone would always have an assignment, interview some relative about something.
Nonchalantly would toss a question out, and the beads of sweat were pouring off as he's trying to answer Uncle Bernie's question.
A lot of people live in fear that, oh my God, is that going to happen to me? So if they get depressed and they don't have the tools to handle their depression, what is their model?
In the end, a lot of people got hurt. A lot of customers got hurt, and it was just a bad thing. Just a bad thing.
Not for nothing, we were supposed to be lifers. You know what I mean? We were following, that suit.
And he asked these guys a bunch of questions, and then he threw this dinosaur. I'll never forget it. He threw this dinosaur, toy dinosaur, on the table, and he says, "This is what Evans is." And you know what happened to these dinosaurs?
He didn't want to be associated with the failure. And I think that he just wanted to detach, because that wasn't what the legacy that he wanted for himself.
He didn't want to wake up and smell the coffee, so he just, he did the things that he enjoyed doing. Especially people who were in the finance side, they were dealing with trying to put out fires every single day and trying to get enough money into the business to be able to pay the bills.
It was a very unique era of what turned out to be the youthquake, a youth boom, all kinds of innovation, new music, new everything.
So that is their legacy, and it's tragic. And these were people's lives and livelihoods. I remember when the stores closed, and Jeff and I got some calls, and people were just sobbing.
As things fell apart, that also became obvious. Well, they shut the doors on people. That was pretty high profile.
With brilliance comes depression.
Yep.
And there are also people who have done research on Eastern European Jews who there's, depression runs through.
A fish has got to swim and an eagle's got to soar. That's their natural temperament and how they want to live and how they want to play. And when that's blocked, people are really unhappy.
Friends, as always, thank you so much for joining me today. It was great spending some time together. I look forward to us convening again very shortly. Until that time, I'm Scott Hunter, and this is the podcast in support of the films Skin on Skin, the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier. We'll see you soon. Have a great day.
On the next episode of the Companion Podcast, in support of the film Skin on Skin, the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier.
Some of their recounting their best, their worst, and their ugliest moments.
We can't pay this. We can't get the money from the people, the banks anymore. We gotta do some business.
And especially because of all my trips to Asia, to Hong Kong and Korea. I mean, David really took the time to teach me things. And, when he passed away, that's what I referenced.
I started in the third floor fur salon. That fur salon was run exactly the same way as in 1955.
He said, okay, all right. Because he trusted me. And these are the first thing I sold. And I would call him back, say, send me some more. He said, you sold it?
We were doing $30 million at cost at that point. That was a lot of business to these guys. I mean, major. And so we get on these buses. There was usually a small group of 10 or 12.
On the next episode of the Companion Podcast, in support of the film Skin on Skin, the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier.